I'm an anthropologist by training, and I think it's all about culture. So culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so I think one of the challenges is how do you create a culture that actually brings out the best entrepreneurial traits in an organization, and at the same time enables companies to continue to deliver short-term profits, particularly if they're a publicly traded company. So finding that balance between the short and the long term from a cultural perspective is particularly challenging, I think. So I think the first thing is how do organizations create space for individuals and teams to step back and explore new areas which might be beyond their core business. So how do you actually do that as an organization is a real challenge for many companies, particularly if they're public companies with the short-term demands of capital markets leaning on them. I think secondly is how do you embrace diversity? I'm not talking gender diversity, I'm talking diversity of perspectives. How can you actually create the conditions to hear different voices in your organization? And I think the third area, which is particularly important, is how do you create an environment where it's okay, a learning environment, where it's okay potentially to fail. So thinking about not so much the return on the investment of a project, but the return on learning of a project. That's what I've seen good organizations. Organizations are particularly strong in innovation, focusing on the return on learning versus the return on investment of these projects. I often see entrepreneurs and hear entrepreneurs complaining about lack of resources, but it's really important to change your mindset and focus on the amount of resources you have. So it's about being resourceful versus being concerned about your lack of resources. I think secondly, we have an expression in my business, avoiding the man with a hammer syndrome, and it's really important to embrace and look at a problem from multiple perspectives versus being like a man with a hammer looking around for a nail to bash the hammer against. So multiple perspectives is really important to embrace as an entrepreneur. And I think the third area is to be bold, to take some risks, be willing to step out of line and ask uncomfortable questions, look at the world from multiple angles in order to uncover potential opportunities. One of the big trends is there's a new model of leadership emerging, which is a leadership model which is more around pausing and asking questions versus charging towards the answer versus focusing on what's known. So how do you actually manage the unknown? How do you explore the unknown? From a leadership perspective, that's a very different model from how we've traditionally been taught to lead. I think the second area is embracing this uncertainty. One of my podcast guests talked about the space between hesitation and commitment, and the need to step, or the willingness to step into that space and be comfortable with this uncertainty that characterizes this VUCA world that we all live in, this volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world that we live in. And I think thirdly, a big theme that keeps on coming out is the importance of company purpose and the ability of leaders to connect individuals with that purpose such that they can really relate to the work they're doing and have a very clear sense of how what they're doing fits in with the overall purpose of the company. So I think a lot of the commentary tends to be on around innovation tends to be the sort of breathless, hyped up conversations around Uber and Tesla and these West Coast companies that are doing an enormous amount of disruptive innovation, but we tend to focus more on long product life cycle, industrialized, heavily regulated companies that are in the areas, for instance, of agriculture or pharmaceuticals or banking or cement. And there's a lot of really interesting innovation going on in there. For example, my background is the agricultural industry, and up until quite recently, the focus was really on bringing new molecules to market. But increasingly, there's been so much money flowing into startups, focusing on drones, focusing on robotics, focusing on new modes of delivery, focusing on big data, and that's beginning to creep into core agriculture. I mean, one of the reasons is that in many crops, at least 50% of the cost of producing the crop is labour, and there are real pressures on labour now. So any labour-saving devices such as robotics are going to have a big impact on the economics of agriculture. So it's still some way from prime time, but that it will happen over time, and agriculture is beginning to undergo a huge shift in production processes. For intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs who are watching this, I think it's really worthwhile reminding you that you are not alone. I've done this kind of work for 20 years. It is challenging and it's hard, and it's sometimes easy to forget that you're not alone. There are other people doing this work in other organizations. So I would urge you to reach out and connect with others in other industries, in other roles, but nonetheless focusing on trying to make change happen in your organization. And this is one of the reasons we developed this program, the Innovation Leadership Circle, because it's important to surround yourself and build an ecosystem around you to support you on this journey, to help you get resourced for some of the challenges that inevitably lie ahead.